The sound of the wind whistling through the cottonwoods was the only companion Luke Carson had left. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above him, the horizon painted in hues of orange and sorrow as the sun dipped behind the hills. He sat on the worn porch of his ranch house, his rough hands cradling a chipped coffee mug. 5 years had passed since the storm that took his wife, Clara, or so he believed. 5 years of silence, of mending fences and breaking apart inside. The locals called him the Ghost Rancher, a man who smiled at no one, who buried his heart beneath the same soil he worked each day. But life, as he was about to learn, had a way of unearthing even the deepest secrets. That morning had begun like any other, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, and trying to ignore the emptiness echoing through the old house. But as Luke returned to the porch, 2 figures appeared at the end of the dusty drive. They were small, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with golden curls that glimmered in the sun. They wore matching denim overalls and held hands as they approached. Luke frowned, setting down his coffee. He didn't get visitors, not out here. When they stopped in front of him, both looked up with wide, curious eyes. And then, in unison, they said the word that shattered the quiet, "Daddy." For a moment, Luke couldn't breathe. The world tilted, his pulse pounding in his ears. He looked around, half expecting a cruel joke, some neighbor's kids playing pretend. But the way those girls looked at him, pure, certain, familiar, made something deep in his chest ache. "I think you've got the wrong man," he managed to say, his voice gravelly from years of silence. But one of them reached into a small satchel and pulled out a faded photograph. It was of him and Clara, standing by the old barn, her pregnant belly between them. Luke's knees went weak. That photo had been taken just days before the accident, the one that had taken her away. "Mommy said to find you," the taller girl whispered. Luke knelt, the earth spinning beneath him. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Mommy said you'd help," she repeated softly. "She couldn't come because she's sick." Luke's heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't possible. Clara had drowned when her car was swept away in the river that stormy night. The rescue team found her vehicle, but not her body. He'd mourned her, buried an empty coffin beside their favorite cottonwood. Now, these 2 little girls stood before him, her voice echoed in theirs. He brought them inside, hands shaking as he poured milk into chipped mugs. They told him their names, Lila and June, and that they'd come from a town 100 miles south, walking, then getting a ride from a trucker who dropped them off near the ranch. "She said this was home," Lila said. Luke felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't know whether to be furious or overjoyed. If Clara was alive, why hadn't she come home? Why had she kept their children a secret? And what illness kept her away now? Questions flooded his mind, but the girls' exhaustion silenced them. He tucked them into the spare bedroom, his late wife's scent still faint in the sheets. That night, sleep refused to come. Luke sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, haunted by memories of Clara's laughter and the promise they made to build a life together on this land. Every creak of the house reminded him she might still be out there, needing him. But what if it was a trick? What if someone was using his grief against him? As the night deepened, he went to check on the girls. Both were asleep, clutching small pendants shaped like a silver horseshoe, Clara's favorite design. His fingers traced the charm, and a single tear fell onto the floorboards. At sunrise, Luke saddled his old horse, Dusty, and set off toward the nearest town, determined to find answers. The sheriff listened quietly as Luke told him everything. "You're saying your wife's alive?" the sheriff asked skeptically. Luke nodded. "I don't know how, but she has to be." They put out calls to nearby hospitals and shelters, but no one had seen a woman matching Clara's description. Then, just as Luke was about to lose hope, the sheriff received a call from a nurse in Billings. A woman named Clara Carson had been admitted 3 days earlier under critical condition. The nurse said she'd been found unconscious in a small cabin with signs of pneumonia and exhaustion. Luke's hands trembled as he drove the long road to Billings, the girls asleep in the back seat. Every mile felt heavier than the last. When he reached the hospital, his heart pounded so hard he could barely speak. The nurse led him to a dimly lit room where a frail woman lay hooked to oxygen. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray, but when her eyes opened, they were unmistakable, Clara's eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered his name. Luke. The sound broke him. He fell to his knees beside her bed, his calloused hands trembling as he reached for hers. Clara. I thought you were gone, he choked out. Tears streamed down his face, raw and unguarded. I almost was, she whispered weakly. She told him how the flood had swept her car off the road but carried her downstream, where she was rescued by an old couple who'd nursed her back to health. But the trauma had stolen her memory for years. When it finally returned, she discovered she'd given birth to twins during her recovery. She'd been too afraid to contact Luke, afraid he'd moved on, that he'd forgotten her. Only when her illness worsened did she tell the girls to find him. Luke listened, his heart breaking with every word. Moved on, he said softly. Clara, I've lived every day missing you. There was never anyone else. Her eyes filled with tears as she reached out to touch his face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I wanted to come home sooner. He held her hand against his cheek, unable to speak. The girls peeked from behind the door, their eyes wide and uncertain. When Clara saw them, her face lit up with fragile joy. My babies, she said, beckoning them closer. The room filled with tears, laughter, and a love that time had tried, but failed, to bury. In the days that followed, Clara slowly regained her strength. Luke stayed by her side, bringing the girls every afternoon to visit. They told stories about the ranch, about the horses and the sunsets, about how they'd help their daddy fix fences when she came home. The nurses often paused to watch, touched by the family's quiet reunion. But Clara's illness was still serious, and doctors warned she'd need months of recovery. Luke didn't care how long it took. He vowed to rebuild everything they'd lost, together. When she was finally well enough to leave, Luke carried her to the truck like he had years ago on their wedding day. The drive back to the ranch was silent except for the soft hum of the wind. When the house came into view, Clara gasped, her eyes filling with tears. You kept it just the same, she whispered. Every board, every nail, Luke said. Didn't have it in me to change a thing. The girls ran ahead, laughing as they explored their new home, their voices carrying across the open land. For the first time in years, the ranch felt alive again. As the days turned into weeks, the Carson family began to heal. Luke taught Lila and June how to ride ponies, while Clara tended the garden she'd once planted from seed. At night, they'd sit on the porch beneath the stars, sharing stories and dreams. Luke still woke sometimes in the dark, fearing it was all just a dream, but then he'd hear Clara's gentle breathing beside him and know it was real. Life had returned, fragile but beautiful, like spring after a long winter. One evening, a summer storm rolled in, thunder echoing across the plains. The rain reminded Luke of the night he'd lost Clara, but this time he wasn't alone. They stood together on the porch, watching lightning dance across the sky. Clara slipped her hand into his. Funny how storms used to scare me, she said softly. Now they remind me that even after the worst ones, there can still be calm. Luke looked at her, tears glistening in his eyes. You came back, he whispered. You always were my calm. The years that followed were kinder. The ranch flourished again, the herd growing strong, the fields green and full. Word spread across the valley about the miracle reunion of the widowed rancher and the wife he thought he'd lost. People came by to visit, to bring food, to hear their story. But Luke always said the real miracle wasn't that Clara came back, it was that hope did. He'd learned that love doesn't die, it only waits for the right moment to be found again. Lila and